Welcome back. Now, government has terminated with immediate effect the national state of disaster on electricity supply constraints. Now, the national state of disaster was declared by the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs in February this year. And Cooperative Governance Minister Thembi Nkadimeng says that the state of disaster was a necessary response with regard to the impact of critical levels of load shedding in the economy and vulnerable sectors such as health and small businesses. Minister Nkadimeng made the announcement yesterday in Pretoria. So to discuss this development, we're joined now via Zoom by the Deputy Cogta Minister, Parks Tau. Mr. Tau, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and thank you very much.
So, literally a month later, the national state of disaster seemingly no longer needed or necessary. Why is that?
Well, Sakina, as the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, together with the National Disaster Management Center, we need to continuously review the national state of disaster and all national states of disaster, in fact. This is done on a monthly basis. And currently the circumstances suggest that you do not need a national state of disaster. If you'd recall, in late January, early February, we were almost at the level of level 8 of shutdown or lockdown rather. No, load shedding. I should correct that, load shedding. And that implied that, in fact, the system was placed at risk. The system at Eskom itself was placed at risk, but it was also placing a whole range of other services at risk, including the supply of potable water to cities and towns, and therefore to communities. The reliability of the electricity supply to hospitals was severely constrained, and a national state of disaster was declared. The circumstances have changed, and that dictates that the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs reviews that state of disaster.
So please explain to us exactly how those circumstances have changed, and also, if you can, just provide us with some examples of how the state of disaster was actually used to mitigate the dangerously high stages of load shedding.
Sakina, firstly, I think it is important to clarify what the role of Cogta is in this regard. Our responsibility is to declare state of disaster when circumstances dictate that we are in a national state of disaster, and therefore the situation is extenuating and demands extraordinary measures to mitigate the impact of load shedding, amongst others. So we're sitting on this side and asking the questions to departments, to Eskom and others. Well, actually, with the reduction of load shedding, with the coming on board of a number of initiatives, including the re-establishment of certain power station capacity, do you still need the state of disaster? Do you still need the capacity to issue directions both on the electricity supply side or on the electricity demand side that demands that you require state of disaster? And it did not pass that test. So for us, it is to determine whether you pass the test to be in a state of disaster, whether you need the Minister of Electricity to issue specific directions that would say, exclude water reservoirs, exclude this, include this, do this. At this point, we don't think that you need those set of circumstances, or the circumstances dictate that, in fact, that would be required. I should say, the Minister of Electricity did indicate yesterday that he would be having a media briefing today to give the country an update on the state of power stations, his visits to the power stations, and what has been done to intervene. So I'd rather not preempt that, but rather emphasize the point that for us, it is to determine whether the circumstances suggest that the country could go on a complete shutdown in terms of electricity, and at this point, there's no risk such as that.
So I'm curious to know what you've been told, because I don't want to preempt, like yourself, what the Minister of Electricity may say, but in terms of the reasons they gave your department, Mr. Tau, in order to withdraw the state of disaster, are you satisfied that the measures that were introduced under the state of disaster are sufficient to equip government with the necessary tools at this stage to address the crisis that initially made you institute that state of disaster to begin with?
We are rather satisfied that they do not need the extraordinary measures. So it's a slightly different approach. We need to be convinced on our side that, in fact, you need the power to issue directions, or whether the Minister of Cogta should issue directions in certain instances. And at this point, no, we don't need that. There isn't a requirement that suggests that, in fact, special circumstances are required that would demand a declaration of a state of disaster. Because the declaration of state of disaster shouldn't become a normal thing. It shouldn't be a normal occurrence to have a state of disaster. It should be that there are extenuating circumstances and that you place in the country at high risk unless you're able to do something. And at this point, notwithstanding the reality that we experience of load shedding and the impact that that has, it is not at a point where it suggests that there would be a complete collapse of the system. It is not suggesting that we're at a stage where our water reservoirs would not be able to supply water, and a whole range of other services could not be provided. And it's an important point to emphasize that it wasn't load shedding itself that was declared a state of disaster. It was the impact of load shedding on a whole range of other services and the risk that placed on other services that demanded that the state of disaster be declared. And with that risk having been mitigated, and with Eskom having done a whole lot of work, including, of course, procurement of emergency capacity that's currently underway, the procurement of battery capacity that's currently underway, the refurbishment of some of the power plants, and therefore units being brought back on track, that's currently underway. And that suggests that you do not need a state of disaster. And the law demands that on a monthly basis, the Department of Cooperative Governance, in conjunction with the National Disaster Management Center, undertakes that review. And having done that review, we determined that you do not need a state of disaster.
So there were, of course, those in society who were of the view, Mr. Tau, that this was not necessary to begin with. Hence the question, what has changed in a month? And also, did litigation factor into your decision to terminate with immediate effect the national state of disaster?
Well, you know, if you track back, Sakina, and you look at the declaration of COVID as a state of disaster, there was litigation whether COVID passed the declaration of a state of disaster. Government is always taken to court or challenged on the basis of the declaration of a state of disaster, and you continue to consider those circumstances. You consider what currently is underway, and you say, well, do I need the state of disaster? And we've determined that you don't need it. So it wasn't primarily the reason that determined that we declare or we terminate the declaration of a state of disaster. But is it necessary for us to defend a situation that has changed? Is it necessary for us to be in court to spend the money in circumstances that have changed? And we determined that actually it is not necessary to be in court in an environment that has significantly evolved. Our reality is that we were at stage 8, threatening to go into stage 10 in February. And we thought that it is important that extra measures are put in place that would be able to say, Eskom, you shall do this, or society, you shall do this, so that you mitigate the possible shutdown or possible impact on other services in an extreme way that demand a state of disaster. At this point, our water reservoirs are performing at a fairly normal state. But if you track back to late January, early February, we were beginning to experience unreliable supply of water into our cities. It was beginning to impact on industry in a particular industry, still impacted, but it was beginning to impact in such a way that the country could not sustain, and therefore demanded that a declaration be done.
Our time is up, but does that mean, Mr. Tau, that should we find ourselves in a similar situation where we're up to stage 8 and stage 10 looming again, going into the winter months, that you will declare another state of disaster? Are we looking at that type of situation?
If the evidence before us suggests that a state of disaster should be declared, certainly it would be.
All right. I'm going to leave it there, Mr. Tau. I can't say from this interview that I am absolutely clear as to what changed between the end of February and now with the withdrawal. But as you say, we're going to wait for Minister Kgosientshe Ramokgopa and see if we can get the answers there. But we leave this here for now. That was Mr. Parks Tau, Deputy Cogta Minister. This, of course, after government terminated with immediate effect the national state of disaster on electricity supply constraints.